The Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain, and all of these other names have been used to describe the impenetrable obstacle that the United States and its allies tried to break during the Cold War. However, there was one crack in this wall that the United States exploited throughout the entire conflict. Hello, I am your host David, and welcome to Eurasia. Without further ado, let's talk about how radio destroyed the Soviet Union right now. As the Soviets took Berlin and, as Winston Churchill stated, an Iron Curtain had descended upon the world, both the Soviets and Americans looked for ways to create their own spheres of their world their own. With multiple examples available, perhaps the most recognizable example is the Berlin blockade, where the Americans airdropped supplies to West Berlin after the Soviet Union cut off all land routes to the city. Yet, as the Cold War dragged on, both the Soviets and Americans became more and more sophisticated. Many different strategies were used by both sides, including spying, pamphlets, and others. However, soon after the end of World War II, the Americans found a secret weapon that would perplex the Soviet Union for the next 40 years. That secret weapon was the radio. Though the radio was dying in the West, the radio industry was booming in the East, and more Soviet families were buying them. Needless to say, however, all radio stations were fully controlled by the Soviet government in Moscow. In 1946, the American government-funded station named Radio in the American Sector started in Berlin in order to, as the name suggests, provide news to Berliners in the American sector of the city. However, as the Berlin Wall was constructed and the Berlin blockade struck the Americans by surprise, the usefulness of this radio station skyrocketed. The Americans started to direct the station toward those in the Soviet section of the city, telling them about the actions of the Soviets, while also using the station to settle down anxious Berliners in the western part of the city. While the Berlin airlift was successful, radio in the American sector was to thank for stopping any misinformation among Berliners. The success of the station during the airlift, as well as other stations throughout the world, was not forgotten, and Congress and others went to the drawing board in order to see how its successes could be used upon the whole Soviet Union. Thus, only a few months after the Berlin airlift in 1949, the American-controlled radio station Free Europe was established in Munich, West Germany, in order to provide Soviet citizens with American-based news. Like radio in the American sector, the vast majority of workers in Radio Free Europe were refugees from the other side of the Iron Curtain. This is especially true for the radio hosts. This was likely the reason that Radio Free Europe would succeed so quickly. Many Soviet citizens were listening to their brothers and sisters instead of the people they were told to hate. Yet, as Radio Free Europe grew immensely, the station only targeted the Soviet Union's satellite states. Thus, in order to separate itself from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was created in 1953. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty operated in similar fashions. Both used the language of the local population, both were funded by the American government, and both broadcasted American propaganda as a reaction to the Soviet propaganda already given. Impressively, by 1954, both radio stations would broadcast in Russian as well as the language of more than 20 people groups scattered throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. All of the radio hosts were from their respective people groups. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty played an important role in uncovering Soviet secrets to the Soviet people. This is true with many things. For example, the Soviet citizens did not learn of Joseph Stalin's death until about 2 days after he had died. It likely would have been longer if both stations had not found out and started broadcasting about a day after his death when the station had finally found out. This is true with the Chernobyl disaster as well. Soon after it had happened, Radio Free Europe started to report on the disaster. However, for about 1 week, Soviet channels either denied its happening or gave misinformation. There are dozens upon dozens of examples like this, but with each and every event that would happen, and with each and every correct news report from either Radio Free Europe or Radio Liberty, the listeners would depend on the American stations more and more for their information. Of course, the Soviet Union tried desperately to block the signals from the station. From about 1945 to 1965, the Soviet Union was extremely unsuccessful in jamming the signal. Yet, even as the 70s approached and the Soviet Union became more successful at jamming, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty became more and more ingenious. There are many cases of spying and Soviet infiltration within the stations. However, while this happened yearly, perhaps the most notable event to happen was the 1981 bombing of the station's headquarters in Munich. Nonetheless, with successes and failures from both the stations and the Soviet Union, the two stations would operate within the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe until the Soviet Union's collapse. The successes of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty did not stop there, however. The stations are alive and well today and operate in the same capacity that they did throughout the Cold War. Of course, as radio is slowly being taken over by social media today, both stations have focused on social media and internet articles as well as retaining their radio broadcasts in most post-Soviet states. Today, these stations have expanded into countries like Iran and Pakistan in order to support the war on terror. It also operates in Afghanistan as Radio Azadi, where it consistently ranks in the top 3 of the most listened radio stations within the country. There are many subsidiaries of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty around Eurasia, but perhaps most notably, in 2014, a new radio station was launched named Current Time. Already, only 5 years later, the station has branched out into a TV station available in most post-Soviet countries. And, most recently, in 2017, the stations launched the fact-checking sites polygraph.info and factograph.info in order to counter Russian misinformation. All in all, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty had a huge impact on providing internal support for the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It provided Soviet citizens as well as those under the Warsaw Pact to receive American-based news that they could not receive under the regimes that did not allow it. Even today, we see the United States employing these Cold War strategies in post-Soviet countries as well as new strategically important countries too. Don't forget to click the like button and click the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay happy, stay humble, stay hopeful, and goodbye.